Why So Cold contains content that is graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. Why So Cold relies largely on police or news documents, eyewitness accounts, press conferences, and interviews. Every episode of Why So Cold is produced with respect to the victims, families, and communities involved.
From Watts Creative Studios, this is Why So Cold. More than 40 years ago, in 1981, 23-year-old Olivia Thorndike was found dead inside her own home. Straight away, the police had two suspects, and it seemed like the brutal murder was going to be an open and shut case. However, even though one person was eventually arrested and charged for Olivia's death, we still don't know for sure who took her life. Olivia Thorndike was born in Lancaster County, Virginia on September 7, 1957, to her parents, Henry and Carolyn Thorndike. According to Virginia's Daily Press, Henry was a prominent farmer and entrepreneur who had been married to Carolyn for almost 20 years by the time of Olivia's birth. The Thorndikes were a large family. Olivia had two brothers, Andrew and Henry Jr., and 5 sisters, Sarah, Evelyn, Anne, Susan, and Alice. During Olivia's childhood, her family relocated to an unincorporated community in Northumberland County located on the Northern Neck. The place was quite ideal for raising children, and as the Thorndikes had plenty of farmland, they kept horses that Olivia and her sisters absolutely loved. There's even a mention in the Daily Press from September 1973 of Olivia and some of her sisters taking part in a local horse riding competition. Her love for horses also led Olivia eventually to meet and befriend a woman named Catherine Storch. In 1974, Catherine's family bought horses from Olivia's family, and soon enough, the two became friends. Other than that, we do not know much about Olivia's life. However, at some point, she did move away from her family's home to Henrico, where she continued her college education and began working. Unfortunately, it was also there that Olivia met her untimely death. On Wednesday, November 25th, 1981, Olivia's uncle was waiting for her at the airport. She was supposed to pick him up that afternoon, but for one reason or another, Olivia never showed up. Back then, people did not have cell phones yet, so it was a little bit tricky for Olivia's uncle to figure out what was going on. Still, there was a landline number, but nobody was answering. The time kept passing until the point nobody had seen or heard from Olivia for hours. Then, around 10:25 p.m., the police were dispatched to the Harbor Village Apartments in western Henrico County. There, the officers discovered the reason why Olivia failed to meet her uncle earlier that day. She lay dead in a pool of blood at the foot of the stairs, leading up to her room on the second floor. For an unknown reason, it was initially reported by the media that Olivia had died due to gunshot wounds in her chest by an unknown assailant. However, the police later corrected the information, saying that Olivia had actually been stabbed 4 times. On top of that, it appeared that authorities already had a suspect, or suspects, 2 of them to be specific. Apparently, in the months leading to her death, Olivia had been harassed and stalked. While the source refused to give names of those who had been causing trouble to Olivia, we do know 2 names through previous incidents. It was not just that she had been harassed by stalkers, but allegedly Olivia had been the victim of an attempted sexual assault. The incident had happened shortly before her death, and Olivia had gone to the police and filed a report, meaning she was in the process of pursuing charges against the offender. That right there is a potential motive. The man in question was Gary Langford, who lived in Lancaster County. According to Olivia, she and Gary had been driving home together from a party in Northumberland County, but on the way, Gary had begun to behave improperly and eventually tried to rape her. Fortunately, it appears Olivia got out of the situation unharmed one way or another. If we take a look at Gary's past, the car ride could have ended much worse. Within the last 5 years before Olivia's murder, Gary had had problems with both his mental health and law enforcement. In 1976, when he was just 20 years old, Gary was tentatively linked to double murder, and newspapers reported that he suffered from at least one mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia. Gary had been treated in a mental health facility at some point and was found unfit to stand trial in at least one criminal proceeding. Of course, being mentally ill does not automatically mean the person is violent, but Gary had proven by his behavior that he was a threat to others, and for that reason, he became one of the main suspects in Olivia's murder. But Gary was not the only suspicious person linked to the case. In Northumberland County, where Olivia's parents' home was located, lived a man named Richard Slaughter. To be more specific, Richard lived in the small town of Reedville, not too far away from where Gary Langford had been living. It has been claimed many times over the years that Richard and Gary knew each other, and might have even been friends. But we cannot say that for sure. However, we do know that Richard definitely knew Olivia. In 1980, a year before her death, Olivia had gone out on at least one date with Richard, but in the end, she had decided it was not going to work out. And what was Richard's response to Olivia not wanting to see him again? He began to harass and stalk her, and the situation soon turned violent. In August 1980, Richard assaulted Olivia by hitting her with a rock. However, even though Richard was charged with assault and battery and later convicted for the crime, he never went to jail. Instead, he agreed to undergo psychiatric treatment, which was not his first time. In the end, it seemed like the mental institution did not do too much for Richard. After his release, he continued to stalk Olivia. Her loved ones later stated that the continuous harassment forced her to change her routines and rearrange her life to avoid Richard. Finally, things got so bad that Olivia filed more than a dozen police reports against her stalker, claiming that Slaughter was stalking her day and night, in person, through the mail, and by telephone. There could not be any more red flags than that. And when Olivia was then found dead, Richard was obviously taken into custody and questioned. However, as the police were unable to find any evidence linking Richard to the murder, he was released within a few hours. A few days later, on November 30th, Richard was convicted of making threatening phone calls to Olivia and her mother. But of course, he once again avoided going to prison by agreeing to receive psychiatric treatment. After that, Richard Slaughter and Gary Langford basically continued with their lives, while Olivia's family tried to find answers to what had happened. Unfortunately, there was just not any. More than a year passed without any new information in the case. But then, in January 1983, 25-year-old Richard Slaughter was suddenly arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Authorities believed he was the one that had found his way into Olivia's apartment in one way or another, and brutally killed her before returning to his home in Northumberland County. For a moment, the young woman's loved ones had a feeling that they were about to get justice for Olivia, but then the rug was once again pulled from under their feet. On March 9th, prosecutors announced that they were not going to proceed with the charges against Richard, and, of course, they did not inform the public how and why this decision had been made. However, Rappahannock Record articles stated, sources close to the case said new evidence was favorable to Slaughter's defense, but declined to elaborate. It would take some time for the whole truth of the situation to be revealed, but eventually it did happen. The real reason why the case against Richard was dropped was the disappearance of a key witness. Apparently, a person with critical information decided to leave town shortly before the trial was set to start. But even though the missing witness forced the prosecution not to proceed with the trial, it did not mean Richard would escape charges completely if the situation would change again. Still, after the whole ordeal, Olivia Thorndike's case was at a standstill for several years. Meanwhile, Richard and Gary continued to cause trouble. On March 25, 1983, Gary was convicted for breaking into a supermarket and stealing approximately $82 worth of beer alongside a friend. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with 3 years being suspended. After his release, it did not take Gary long to be arrested again in August 1985, this time for driving under the influence of alcohol. He was later charged with possession of stolen property and violating the terms of his probation. Awaiting his trial, Gary reportedly told other inmates he had played a part in a double murder 10 years prior. A couple, Dale and Charlotte Rogers, had been murdered around 7 p.m. on February 27, 1976, in their own home. Charlotte was taking a bath, while Dale was in the kitchen preparing dinner, when a man with a shotgun suddenly walked in and shot both of them dead. The bodies were found by the victim's teenage daughter the following afternoon. The police did not find any signs of forced entry, nor any other evidence that would have pointed them in the right direction. For years, there was no progress in this case, but investigators did interview basically anyone they could in the area, meaning hundreds of people. One of the persons the police questioned was Gary Langford, whose parents actually lived next door to Dale and Charlotte Rogers. According to Gary, he had been with friends playing cards at the time of the murder, but police had a hard time verifying his alibi. Still, it would take 10 years and Gary himself boasting about his role in the case to finally charge him. In February 1986, the trial began. Gary's charges included breaking into the Rogers home with the intent to commit murder and possibly rape and robbery, 2 murders, stealing the couple's car, and using a gun in the commission of the crime. After 3 days of testimony, Judge Dixon L. Foster sent the case to the jury. But they could not come to an agreement, which of course meant a mistrial. A new trial was scheduled to start in April, but it did not begin until July due to some delays. During the second trial, Gary's mental health issues became public for the first time. According to the man himself, he had suffered a full-on mental breakdown in 1978 after his wife left him. As a result, Gary's ability to distinguish reality from delusions became impaired. Eventually, he was committed to Eastern State Hospital after he began to behave violently towards his stepfather and other family members. Still, even though the case against Gary seemed pretty solid, the jury was again unable to agree to his guilt or innocence. And so, the second try ended in a mistrial too. As a result, Judge Foster completely dismissed the murder charges against Gary Langford. Afterward, Gary still had to serve some time in prison for his other crimes, but he never faced murder charges again, not for the deaths of Dale and Charlotte Rogers, nor Olivia Thorndike. There's not much more information available about Gary's later years, but he did pass away in August of 2002 and was buried in his hometown of Lancaster, Virginia. While Gary definitely had a reason to harm Olivia, the police have not focused that much on him as a suspect during the years. While we do not know the reason, it is always possible the authorities have evidence that has not been made public that suggests someone else. Perhaps Richard is more likely the killer. As mentioned before, Richard began stalking Olivia after she refused to see him again. However, she was not the only young woman Richard harassed. In Henrico County alone, Richard was convicted not only for the crimes against Olivia and her family, but for misdemeanor assaults on 4 separate women. All of those women told a similar story of Richard approaching them in public places and sexually or physically assaulting them. In addition, there was something else that linked all 4 women. They were all tall, thin, and blonde, or with light-colored hair, like Olivia. It seemed like Richard had a type, and yet, despite numerous criminal charges, he's been able to avoid jail. As Detective Dorton said, he's always seemed to get out of it through the channels of psychiatric help. He'd get himself in a bit of a box and then agree to check himself into a psychiatric hospital. For that reason, Richard was able to stalk and harass Olivia too for over a year. No matter the place or method, Richard kept appearing at Olivia's home and workplace, in addition to non-stop calls and creepy letters. And when he didn't get a response from Olivia, Richard began to make calls to her mother. For that crime, he was eventually convicted in November 1981. Disturbingly, after Gary Langford attempted to assault Olivia, Richard began to include details of that incident in his calls and letters. And yet, Richard claimed he did not know Gary, which is a little hard to believe, especially because of the phone call he made to Olivia's mother just 2 days before her murder, saying, "Olivia Thorndike is dead. She should not have prosecuted the case against Gary Langford." All of this, together with the fact that Richard had literally hit Olivia in the head with a rock in August of 1981, definitely made him look like the most obvious suspect in the case. And yet, even though he was arrested and charged with Olivia's murder, he eventually walked free. During the years that followed, Richard Slaughter found a new target to harass, a woman named Joanne Stinson, who lived in Topsom, Maine. However, Joanne fought back against her stalker, so hard in fact that she eventually filed a groundbreaking civil suit in 1994. The Nationwide Violence Against Women Act and the civil suit finally forced Richard to stop stalking Joanne. While he had not followed through with all the terms of his civil judgment, meaning paying compensation to Joanne, she is still happy with the outcome. Joanne says she didn't care about the money, as long as Richard quit harassing and stalking her and other women.
24-year-old Olivia Thorndike's life came to a sudden end November 25th, 1981. Quickly, 2 suspects emerged, and we've now learned of a person of interest. But as of today, her murder remains a mystery.
Late Wednesday night, Henrico police found Olivia Thorndike brutally stabbed to death in her Harbor Village apartment.
I knew she had somebody stalking her.
Friends, family, and detectives have had their suspicions.
He began showing up at my workplace.
But 4 decades later, no one is behind bars for the murder of Olivia Thorndike.
We've got to get some kind of justice for this woman and her family.
It was the day before Thanksgiving at the Harbor Village Apartments in Western Henrico. Thorndike was supposed to be heading out of her apartment on Main Mass Court to pick up a relative at the airport. When she didn't show up, police checked in.
We had to force entry. They were faced with a traumatic scene.
Lieutenant Matt Pecca with Henrico Police says the 24-year-old was found dead at the bottom of the stairs. She had been stabbed multiple times. There was no sign of forced entry.
The doorway was not damaged. That's a crucial piece of this case. Who would have gained access?
We had come home just after her body had been found.
Donna Spurrier was a neighbor.
There was yellow crime tape and red and blue lights everywhere.
She remembers the tragic day well.
Over the years, almost 40 years now, it's always been on my mind. It's always been on my mind. What happened? Why did somebody get away with this?
She has always wondered if she may hold the clue to Thorndike's killer. Earlier that day, Spurrier was waiting for her fiancé to pick her up.
I continued to look out the window. He was running late.
She spotted something strange.
I just noticed randomly that there was someone sitting in a car in front of my apartment facing Olivia's apartment. My best recollection was a green station wagon type car, and had his arm out the window in November reading the paper.
We still do not have the answers to what really happened to Olivia, but that does not mean efforts to find out the truth have stopped. As mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Olivia had a friend named Catherine Storch. Catherine is fully convinced of Richard Slaughter's guilt and has an ongoing war against him. Using classified ads and social media, Catherine keeps Olivia's story alive. On January 16, 2022, she posted on Twitter, "Cold cases deserve expanded DNA testing. Olivia's case should be more than a file in a drawer. What's it going to take?" It's been more than 40 years since Olivia Thorndike met her tragic end, and while her loved ones are still looking for justice, for now, her murder remains unsolved. This has been an episode of Why So Cold. For the source material used in this episode, visit whysocold.com.